Righto, let's get going. I did send an email survey around to anyone I could think of on my email list to see what they thought about gravel in soils, and invariably they thought it was a bloody good topic to have a look at and focus on, but most of them were interested in the management of gravelly soils as opposed to the impact of gravel in soils on management. Two very different things. Now, I'm unlikely to have time to come back to the former, namely the management of gravelly soils, and so I'm going to concentrate very much on the latter, which is taking account of the gravel content of soils should this impact on some of our management decisions. And that was what they found. And so I had a desktop study, was what I had in mind. Originally we went for big dollars and there was going to be a lot of parallel direct measurement work and so on, but the funding body couldn't afford that, so they've got me as a desktopper. And the payoffs from the system were to look at whether some management advisory system should change on the account of the gravel or whether they've got it right, that sort of thing. So I did that, and that's the topic of this particular talk. I spent most of my time going up dead ends, and I'm incompetent in my old age, in looking at soil-water relations and gravel and what I could get from regression type studies because I couldn't do direct measurements. And the third part of it was I contracted out a root study to Alas in Tasmania because my best definition of gravel in soils apart from their particle size is a no-go zone for roots, which has wonderful implications for all sorts of things in terms of nutrient management, efficiency and all the rest of it. And so I wanted to get a handle on what putting inert objects into a medium would do to root growth. Now you won't hear about that either today. To win the dollars, you have to have something catchy. I've won most dollars by just asking a series of questions. I got 10 years research for residue management and how it impacts on nitrogen just by asking unanswered questions. And here basically is the set of questions that you ask. If you assume that gravel is inert, then, and here I've said with 50%, does that come up big enough to read? But anyhow, what it says is that if it's inert and you've got 50% gravel in a soil, compared with the same soil without it, you've only got half the amount of nutrients there. Half the rate of fertiliser would give you the same concentration if in fact your plants are feeding on concentration rather than amount. Lime rates could be halved to raise the pH 1 unit if you had 50% gravel. At a given organic carbon sequestration, you've only got half as much there if you're just looking at organic carbons if you've gone and diluted it with 50% gravel. The soil would store half as much water, which is a two-edged sword. This means you get up to field capacity a bit on lighter showers, but you get more drainage and supposedly you might get more runoff. Except that Craig showed me a paper where putting rocks on the soil makes it puddle more and you get less runoff. I was amused at Badgingarra you get better pastures on your gravelly soils, and one of my hypotheses was that 5 millimetres became 10 millimetres when you got 50% gravel, and therefore you've got a higher water content near the surface to germinate the clover, whereas on the sands 5 millimetres is 5 millimetres and that rapidly dries out. Then you do things like some of the important and lasting soil properties, namely the buffering capacity for pH, for phosphate, for cations. All of those can get halved. What implications are there of those? These are all good questions. Each one could have a PhD on it. I haven't given it that. In terms of gravelly soils in WA, Dennis Van Gool found this for me. These are the percentage of soils with greater than 20% gravel in the surface. And then you've got your shading according to their relative occurrence. So 50 to 100% of soils in that gravel zone have greater than 20% gravel in the surface. What I'm talking about here is something like 3 million hectares of 18 million hectares of alienated agricultural land would be classed as gravelly soils. And what are gravels? Well, we don't need to get into this, so we won't. But this whole question of the inert nature of gravels versus their reactivity is the crucial one. What you've got is a complete family from basically gravel is almost like a clay soil through to it being inert chips of rock, okay? And that whole suite is there, and again, I haven't wasted my mental energy, which is pretty limited, on handling that. I've just decided for the rest of this talk basically that I will be looking at inert gravel as an inert object with respect to water, nutrients, etc. But we'll put a few riders on that. This is stuff that I didn't know you had the time to get to Perth, Dougie Sawkins, but anyhow, Doug gave me this slide which shows that there are two main groups of gravels according to their chemical composition. There are the ones that are sesquioxide rich, that is the iron and aluminium rich gravels, which are there shaded in blue, and the browner ones, while they've got sesquioxides in them obviously, they are silica rich. And that's about all I'm going to say about that, except that there is a big range of gravels out there. That's known as a Bowden Yallumbee gravel out my back door at home. That I would picture is going to be fairly inert. I know it's not inert, but it's these nice rounded little buckshot gravel stones with a nice polished surface. And it's not going to be completely inert, but let's call that inert just for the sake of getting home the message that there are inert and non-inert ones. And that's one where they're basically just hardened mottles, and I would think they absorb water, they absorb chemicals and all sorts of things. They let roots go down between them in the interstices, i.e. they concentrate roots. And you've got everything in between, but we won't get hung up on that. And then just because gravels ain't gravels necessarily, that was one where I took a shot of a gravel, and when you look at the surface of undisturbed gravels, they look to be pretty high percentage. Well, they are in the forest country anyhow. And that one there on the left is undisturbed because raindrop and wind action removes the fines, whereas you just take off that top surface and you're looking at the real nature of the thing, and in this case there's probably only 20% of that soil does not go through a 2 millimetre sieve. So yeah, the guts of the paper, for what it's worth, is how does gravel content impact on recommendation systems, and here I'm talking about input recommendation systems, and we've just heard from Wayne how important inputs are, and if we do actually work dollars into the argument, then we might even start thinking about, if we've halved the nutrient supply, does that mean we double the dollars we have to spend on fertiliser? Or if we double the concentration, does that mean we can halve the amount of fertiliser? All those sorts of issues come up. And as it happens, gravel percent is taken into account with the dot points there. As it happens with herbicides and pesticides, all those people they sort of were a bit paternalistic towards me in my questions, but why on earth would you want to play with gravel stones? There are far more important things there. There are the correlates with gravelly soils. There are things that the dose responses to herbicides and so on, if you put the gravel in and say you're doubling the concentration in the matrix, that doesn't matter because it's such a flat response curve, doubling the concentration has no impact. Other parts of it were that if you spray 100 litres out, which is 0.01 of a millimetre per on a hectare of ground, it just wets the exposed gravel, and even though they don't absorb much, the gravel stones absorb a little, and then the subsequent rains do not wash it off into the matrix and make things a lot more concentration. So we had those sorts of arguments, and some of them I tried to address. Granular pesticides, I think, might be like granular fertilisers. In high fixing soils, granular phosphate fertiliser, your response to doubling the rate is not doubling the concentration, it's doubling the number of hits that roots will make on fertilised soil, and the same thing goes for a granular pesticide. If you double the concentration in the matrix, then the pests only have half the chance of escaping it, of not running into it. Yeah, all exciting stuff. Now, a lot of the fertiliser recommendation systems, particularly those for P and K and to a lesser extent N, depend on soil test calibration curves. And that is not very clear, but it makes the point. The top curve there has come out of the Better Fertiliser Decisions for Crops database, which has I tend to knock it a bit, but it has the major advantage of putting data up there ready for you to play with. And for me, the important thing is playing with the data and not the summaries that someone else makes of it. But be that as it may, the top one gives you a spread of 122 wheat trials that have had phosphate put on them, and a line's been driven through that, and if you go up to 90% of that, you can get a critical level. And then the one down on the lower left is the same set of data, but only those without the gravel, and the one on the right are those with the gravel. And those those are pristine. I like the top one because it's what I call robust. That is, you've driven your points, your line through the points, so if a grower comes in with one with a lot of gravel or not, you've still got it. It's one of the points away from the line maybe, or comes in with something aberrant, it's a point away from the line, but you've got your best bet, which is better than using the average yield percentage. You've got something that makes a bit of sense. Now, if you discriminate on gravel in this particular case, then the lines go up like this, and you'll see that the average line is very little different from both the blue and the green ones, with the gravels and without the gravels. So the spread of points is such that there's bugger all in it. But the interesting thing is that most of our reputable recommendation systems in WA, and I reckon they're pretty reputable because I helped build most of them, albeit most of the local practitioners don't know the current practitioners because they weren't alive 30 years ago. But the most of them now have an adjustment in them for gravel percent. That is, if you've got 50% gravel, then they reduce the supply of the nutrients by 50%. And the question becomes one of where is this appropriate? When is it appropriate to do this? What it does when you apply it as a blanket is it invariably increases the rate of recommended fertiliser if you've got gravel in the soil. Now, and one other issue here that I must emphasise is that gravel percent of soils is very poorly estimated. Now, I've hunted through some of the best pedological books, that is the soil classifiers. I don't care where I go to our local databases. People do not estimate gravel adequately for doing a quantitative study about gravel. They do visuals on it. They look at, so that's almost a volumetric thing, or if they're down from the surface, it's just a surface area, exposed area thing. They don't do weights, and most times it's just a feeling in your water, oh, this is about 20%, and you'd be right for 3 million hectares. If you just said 20, you'd be right a lot of the time. They do not measure it correctly, and then our soil sampling equipment, which gets the material, the fines that go to the laboratory, a lot of it excludes gravel. Certainly a pogo will exclude large gravel. You've got ones that grind gravel. So when the sample gets to the lab and the little girl puts it onto her visual scale of what gravel percents are, the point I'm making is that even though it is not well estimated, it is taken into account in recommendation systems. And one must query that, particularly as those recommendation systems are normally referring to a calibration curve, which we saw earlier, which goes through a thing which already has soils with gravels in them. So it's already taken into account if there's any weighting to be had albeit not explicitly. So there is a real question here. Now, there are other recommendation systems that are basically go on the principle of here's the crop yield, therefore the demand, you calculate how much of a nutrient's in it, and here is the soil supply. I must admit at that level you're doing kgs per hectare. Here is the soil supply, which you can estimate from fertiliser histories, rotations if it's nitrogen, whole range of things, or if you're using a soil test from a less than 2 millimetre analysed sample. And then that has to get converted into kgs per hectare so that you can take supply away from demand to give you the fertiliser recommendation, and never a dollar shall be seen in that particular little line of argument for making a fertiliser recommendation. But we do use it. There are places where we use it, and quite appropriately. Its biggest problem was the 2008 price hike when fertiliser went up by a factor of 2 or 3, and you get exactly the same recommendation using that demand minus supply equals fertiliser recommendation approach. But here I want to make the point that when that comes into a fertiliser recommendation system, you do have to convert things to kgs per hectare. And to do that properly, you need to know the bulk. If you're doing it from a less than 2 millimetre chemical analysis, you need to know the bulk density of the soil and the depth of the soil and the gravel content of the soil. All three of those if you're going to do it properly. Now, no one has the time to do things properly, so you go in and you estimate bits. But the one that I want to point out is that in our soils where I've measured up to 70% gravel in soils, most of them are down, well, that 20 that we're talking about in the surface, 30, 40s, but they have a bigger variation if you ignore them or choose to use them than bulk densities that might vary from 1.3 through to 1.6 or 1.7. That is that you're making far grosser errors by ignoring gravel than you are by ignoring bulk density or assuming a 1.5 and so on. So that's part of the story. Well, these are other implications of inert gravel. They can induce more leaching, and this actually does have implications for the herbicide people when you've got a mobile herbicide that's supposed to work in the surface and not the seeds aren't further down or whatever. But having gravel in a soil means that it should be better drained as long as it doesn't correlate with something else like clay and so on. It affects nutrient buffering, and in this one here, I noticed in the previous talk that Weaver's name was taken in vain. This was his honours work, and it's a beautiful bit of work, but it looks at phosphate buffering in gravel, where he sampled down a pediment. Those gravel percents across the bottom are gravel percents of 4 different soils, and he then measured the buffering, which is used in our phosphate recommendation systems to discriminate soils, whether it's called a PRI or a PBI or whatever. It is used, and you can see that it only varies about 20%. It's the top blue line on that. That's the less than 2 millimetre buffering, whereas the 3 lines in the middle there are looking at whole soil from different points of view, and they tend to vary by about 70 or 80%. So using the less than 2 millimetre and not taking account of gravel to discriminate might be a problem. And none of the fertiliser recommendation systems I looked at, which do use PBI, don't use gravel. Okay? Think of that, Dirk. Dirk's a great one for PBIs and gravel, and he'll be giving a great talk on it soon, I'm sure. And Weaver and co went and came up with this thing, which is the percent reduction in phosphate required as gravel goes up. And look what it does. It says for clover and wheat that you need less fertiliser. The percent reduction is bigger as you go to gravelly soils, whereas all our fertiliser recommendation systems do it the other way around. They do it from the point of view of supply being reduced by gravel. So what I'm making here basically is a case for more work. Liming, the Oplime used to have gravel in it, now doesn't, but the version that's used commercially, Rob Sands' one, has gravel in it and takes account of it the right way. Because you're not diluting a supply, in this case you are concentrating an input, then yes, 50% gravel means that you can get the same pH change with half the amount of lime as if you didn't have 50% gravel, okay? carbon sequestration. Fran's into this in a big way. I had a look at her good book, and gravel is actually mentioned, and I'll be corrected on this, but I don't think anyone ever tries to measure it correctly or take it into account. Now, any carbon accounting system that tries to do the gravel thing has to do depth, bulk, density and gravel. And I've done the herbicide bit, and then this is the bit where everyone else was interested in, which was the management of gravelly soils versus other soils. And there are a whole host of correlates that go with gravelly soils, and they do come into and are taken into account. And I can scratch the surface of any advisor in this room and they'll tell me, oh, weeds are worse on the gravelly hills than on the sands, and they'll have all sorts of anecdotal evidence about gravels. In this talk that I've just given you, it's all about should we quantitatively take account of gravel percent. I understand that you don't make adjustments to the pH. The pH is measured on the fines material, and the only place that I see gravel coming into it, that effectively changes the buffering capacity of the soil. And I think in Opplime it actually did that if you had high gravel then you had a lower buffering capacity of the soil. But certainly in the Rob Sands version, which is on the web for making lime recommendations, he does a 1-for-1, 50% gravel, half the rate of lime. What happens is one would expect that with a gravelly soil and you have the same amount of acid going in from whatever source, and it will be source dependent on a lot of other arguments, but from whatever source, then yes, the pH should drop faster on the 50% gravel soil than on the other. And this might well be why the pH, which is generated in the surface mainly from the nitrogen cycle in the forest soils, why we're getting some very low pHs in the surface of those soils, because they've got 50% gravel, and they're growing big crops, I might add. They grow big amounts of pasture and bigger, so the gravel hasn't buggered their yield potential much. But part of the story also is that you put your ton of lime out on the gravel soil, it will penetrate deeper faster because you are you are getting it, well maybe it won't because you haven't got enough dissolving power in the less amount of buffering. There's certainly two-edged. It works both ways. For the lime and the acidity, the gravel does the logical thing. I say, in theory I say that. This is the thing. We need people to measure it, such as Weaver, who did the phosphate stuff. Yeah, and for nitrogen, I do have a case, and I think there is a case for saying because nitrogen's mobile and it's not buffered, then the argument that 50% gravel reduces the supply by 50% is a bloody good argument. And yes, the nitrogen recommendation systems aren't directly soil test calibrated. They have a little bit of the inputs from there, but a large amount comes from calculation, and I would take gravel into account in those systems, and they do. There are a lot of things that go together with gravel, and as it happens you might have a lot higher organic carbons. Gillespie showed me some today at West 2J, in the forest country, that are running 5, 6, 7s and 8s. Now, if you go and have appropriately taken account of your rotational inputs, your soil organic nitrogen inputs, then yes, that other bit of the supply, which is how it affects the less than 2 millimetre analyses, that is the ammonium and nitrate extracted nitrogens, that's the only way that it's used, I might say. It's in adjusting those to a whole soil basis so that they can match these other inputs. Do you want early vigour on your soils or not? Probably don't. And you have those sorts of things come into a fertiliser recommendation miles and miles away from a critical level. Miles and miles. You've got all this other construct that has to go on top to make a rational fertiliser recommendation and system.